Welcome to Come Follow Me, week 19, where we look at Mosiah chapter 7 through to 10. And we're going to do something a little bit different today, and that is to look at the text in relation to the dictation and understand it as an oral produced text. And Mosiah 7 is great for this, to be able to look at some of the repetition that's happening and why. Mosiah chapter 7 tells the story of Ammon, who is in the land of Zarahemla with King Mosiah, and King Mosiah is desirous to know what's happened to the people who've gone up to the inherited land of Lehi, Nephi, and what's happened to them. And so he sends Ammon, and Ammon goes there. He gets captured by the king, and the king doesn't know who he is. But then we learn that the king is called Limhi, and he's a grandson of Zenith, who has inherited this particular land and becomes subject to the Lamanites. And this sparks the story that goes on for a number of chapters. But I want to highlight in this particular chapter a number of repetitions, because there is a ton of them in here that indicate that Joseph is producing this orally, which means that he's telling a story and he's telling it again and again, because if you wrote this down, you wouldn't write it like this. You would be much more succinct. So if you look at the text, you see a number of features, and one is that it's going to tell you this understanding or this information, and it's going to repeat the same information, often in the same phraseology, again further into the text. Along with the repetition is a number of restatements that suggest a kind of a chiasmic structure. So this is quite interesting too, where you kind of describe something in one direction and then back again in the opposite direction. And I've tried to go through the text and so that you can see it, and the idea that of these kind of repetitions that are happening, these phrases and information which is going to be repeated further down in the text. A good example is 11 and 12, where you see the idea that he was permitted to speak. And then in 12, you see this repeated twice. He was permitted to speak. He's permitted to speak. The idea that this is being produced verbally, and so there's a lot of repetition and a lot of phrases that are repeated again and again. And we almost have this idea that a narrator is telling the story, and then the characters in the story are repeating back the information that already the narrator has said. It's incredibly verbose. And we just see phrases all over that are repeated. Bondage to the Lamanites, bondage to the Lamanites, slaves, slaves, tax with a tax, grievous to be born. These are all phrases that have come up again and again in the text of Mosiah 7. Information that's earlier in the chapter is then repeated back to the reader again later in the chapter. And we also have this idea that Limhi then gathers the people together to the temple to hear the words that he shall speak. And this has just happened with King Benjamin. He's in the exact same phraseology. So there are a ton of repetitions within the chapter, and then there's a lot of repetitions to corresponding chapters. And some of the restatements are also corrections in the text, because Joseph is saying something and realizing that's not quite right, and he's restating it, and this happens a number of times. And he's also restating the lesson that's above this chapter, which is that the people of Limhi are in bondage because they haven't kept the commandments. So it's a cautionary tale. And so with all of this repetition in this chapter, if you boil it down just to its key concepts, it would cover maybe 2 or 3 verses. But because you're saying it in a verbose, repetitive way, it ends up to be 24 verses. And this really shows the oral nature of Joseph composing this in the moment of oration. So now let's look at the second part of Mosiah chapter 7, because it talks a little bit about what's going on here, and we may be able to understand this in the context of Joseph's life. The people of Limhi are in a desperate situation. They're in bondage to the king of the Lamanites, to the outsiders, and it's just not great. And so the narrator has to give an understanding of why this has happened to them. And the biggest one, of course, is that they've fallen into transgression. And this is the mechanism by which they have fallen into the hands of their enemies. Now, if this is Joseph talking about his life, what is he talking about? Well, he's in Harmony, Pennsylvania, of course, but he's really interested in what's happening to his family in Manchester. And of course, they're getting evicted from their land. Lucy has said in her autobiography that by the end of 1828 and maybe into 1829, they're being kicked out of the framed house and they have to move in with Hiram in the log cabin. Effectively, the landlord has taken half of their possessions. Joseph is concerned about them in Harmony, but he's not in a position he can do much about it. But maybe the Hales, or the Mulekites, the people of the land of Zarahemla, which I think is Harmony, have gone. And maybe one of the Hales brothers has gone upstate to New York and has looked in on the Smith family and given them some support. And that's probably where we've got the story of Ammon. And in these last verses of Mosiah chapter 7, Joseph is really blaming his dad for being a terrible father. He's King Noah in the story, right? That we're going to learn about more. But the idea that his dad has really squandered the family commandments, that he's slain a prophet of the Lord. And also, perhaps, Joseph Smith Sr. doesn't really believe in Christ. He doesn't believe he's going to come. And so these verses at the end of Mosiah chapter 7 are really giving the understanding that God is Jesus, and Jesus will take on the form of man by coming down and being subject. It's a very triune, modalist God, but this is exactly what Joseph believes at this particular point. And Joseph is really making this connection as his father has been the source of this sowing of unrighteousness that has caused the family all of this pain and affliction and bondage. And we see those same repetitions right at the very end, but we also see the understanding that if you turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart, that he will deliver them from bondage. And this is what Joseph is hoping for his family, and that they'll be able to be released, that Limhi, who's Hiram, who's now the head of the family, can now be rejoined with Joseph. And Joseph, of course, is King Mosiah in Harmony, but he's also righteous. And if the family come to Joseph's understanding and righteousness, they will be delivered and prospered in the land. Mosiah chapter 8 is almost exclusively about Oliver Cowdery. Oliver has come to scribe for Joseph on the 5th of April 1829, and he has come from the same New England folk magic tradition that Joseph is from, except that his particular divining skill is with a rod, and he's been able to get revelations via that way. So he believes that he can translate because, of course, Joseph is not overly special. He's just the conduit for God, and Oliver can be as well. And Joseph gets a revelation, which becomes Doctrine and Covenants section 8, that confirms this, that Oliver has got a gift, that he's able to translate, that he should be able to do what Joseph is doing. But Joseph is producing this on his own, of course, and he doesn't want Oliver to do it, but he needs to make it possible for Oliver to think that he can. And then when he fails in section 9, he's able to give the revelation that it's not his time to translate. This will happen for him later, and that the Lord wants him to just be a scribe. We can show this because in Doctrine and Covenants 8, it has the same wording in it, the idea of asking for that which you ought not, and also the mysteries of God and the ability to translate these ancient records. These are the phrases that come up in Mosiah chapter 8. Now, there are a number of errors in Mosiah chapter 8, and I'm not going to point them out just because there's other things to talk about. But if you see the word or, you should look at the phrases before and after to see what Joseph is changing. And also there's a number of things that he kind of gets wrong, so he has to repeat it in a completely different way. Ammon, though, gets to see the plates that Limhi has, that has history, which becomes the next few chapters of Mosiah. And the king wants to know if there's anybody who can translate, because he sent scouts out and they went to the land northward and they found a land within the many waters, so the Great Lakes area, which was covered with bones and people that were so numerous because they had all of these structures. And they brought back 24 graven plates that are of pure gold that then contain the record of the Jaredites that we'll learn about later. But King Limhi wants to know if anybody can interpret the language, because he wants to know what is on the plates, because he wants to know about the destruction of these people. It's a complete metaphor for the Book of Mormon, and Joseph is trying to help Oliver understand that this particular gift of seeing and translating is something very special. You have to have special interpreters like a seer stone, and it's a high gift from God, and the idea that a seer is greater than a prophet. So in this way, Joseph can elevate himself over Oliver and subdue Oliver, so Oliver just becomes his scribe. And being a seer, Joseph is now becoming a great benefit to his fellow beings. Back in verse 13, we see that phrase, he ought not. In verse 19, we see the phrase, those great mysteries are contained in the plates. And we can correlate that with Doctrine and Covenants 8, so we know that this is happening at exactly the same time. It's pretty genius of Joseph to confirm it in these revelations and this Doctrine and Covenants sections, but also in the text of the Book of Mormon, and also to put Oliver just a little bit less than himself so that Oliver will do the scribing work while Joseph then relates the story. And yet again, we see that parallel between King Mosiah and also Joseph, both being seers, both translating ancient records, both getting this great gift of God. Joseph is using King Mosiah to talk about himself. If you want to know what I mean when I say that the Book of Mormon started off as a Christian adventure story, the only two chapters you need to read are Mosiah chapter 9 and 10. Chapters 9 and 10 are a great adventure story that pits the heroes against the villains, and it would make any Tolkien fan proud because there's a storyline right in the text. Mosiah 10, 9 and 10 really show this. You got the understanding that the women and children are hidden in the back, that the old men and the young men were armed and they're going out to battle, and they placed everybody by their ranks according to their age. This is the scene at Helm's Deep, and you can really see it in the text, and the idea that the king, even though he's old, he's going to go out to battle with his hands because he's going to save his people. But you also notice something incredibly interesting about these two chapters. They are mirrors of each other. In fact, they have the same text. In Mosiah chapter 9, verse 16, the people are being armed with bows and arrows and swords and cimenters and clubs and slings. And then in the next chapter, the Lamanites are being armed with bows and arrows and swords and cimenters and stones and slings. What is happening here is that Joseph is crafting this story, and it's exactly the same. It's just being reiterated in chapter 9 and then told again in chapter 10. And there are the same story arc, the same wording, the same understanding. I mean, they're slightly different, of course, because he's telling it orally, and so there are differences in the text, but you can see all the points along the arc of the storyline being repeated. I've done up a table so you can see this side by side, Mosiah chapter 9 and Mosiah chapter 10. And there is a little bit of commentary about the Lamanites, which I've excluded from this, which we'll talk about later. But when you line them up side by side, you can see the wording, the phraseology, the storyline, and it is a complete mirror. And here's the second half. Joseph is trying to teach a lesson, and that is that if you go with the strength of God into battle, you're going to win. And if you don't have God with you, you're going to lose. And so he uses this same story in 9, and he just reworks it for the story in chapter 10. It's actually really beautifully done, but it is a story, and it's a story with a story arc, and it's a story that teaches a lesson, and so it's being used repeatedly, and these two chapters side by side can show us that. The Christian adventure story that is King Zenith is just fabulous and worth a detailed look. Let's talk about the shadow side of Christian adventure stories, because this often pits Christians against non-Christians. And in the context of America, this was white settlers against Native Americans. When you tell an us and them narrative, particularly a white settler industrial nation against a brown, dirty, savage people who are unindustrious and filthy, you tell a story that allows warfare which results in genocide. Mosiah chapter 9 and 10 tell this story. It tells the idea that the Lamanites, the Native Americans, are cunning and crafty because they're trying to bring the Nephites, the settlers, into bondage. They're lazy and idolatrous people, and they want to glut themselves on the labors of the settlers. The Lamanites are ungodly. They don't have the strength of the Lord. They're mighty and strong as a people, but they're wild and ferocious and bloodthirsty, and they believe that they're driven out, and they've been wronged in the wilderness, and they've been wronged by the settlers. But Zenith tells the story that they don't understand the dealings of the Lord, that they've hardened their hearts, that they have mistook the idea that God has made the Americas an inheritance for the Europeans, and they just have to fall in line. And also that they have the scriptures, they have the brass plates, the words of Moses, and this gives them preeminence and rights over the Native Americans. And so Zenith makes the argument that the Lamanites have taught their children these terrible traditions, and that they hate them and they want to murder them and they want to plunder them and destroy them. And this is the cause that King Laman has used his cunning and his craftiness to deceive, because they just really want the Nephites, or the white settlers, to be destroyed. And you can imagine this kind of rhetoric as a defense and an explanation for the Native Americans and their attacks on white settler communities. Even though those same communities were taking land, taking resources, and basically starving them. We learn that when the Lamanites come to battle, they have their heads shaved. They're almost naked except for a leather girdle around their loins. And because the Nephites are so much more prepared, and because they have the strength of God on their side, they slaughter the Lamanites. In Mosiah chapter 9, they slay 3,043 of them, and only 279 of the Nephites are killed. But in Mosiah chapter 10, they did drive them out of the land, and they slaughtered them with such a great slaughter, they don't even count how many people are killed. This is horrific. This is genocide. This is colonialism, and it's written into the Book of Mormon as if it's justified, because God said that these people were the new inheritors of the land. And the Lamanites, the Native Americans, who are explicitly called out in the text and labeled and detailed, they are going down, and it is totally righteous. Mosiah chapter 9 and 10, this Christian adventure story, is really the basis for which justifies genocide in North America. Because the story of Zenith is a story made up to explain the understanding of the settlers in America and their relationship to the Native Americans, it's also got a number of anachronisms that are really interesting to look at. Firstly, there's an internal anachronism, and for this you have to go back to Omni. Remember, Omni is written at the very end to harmonize between the replacement text and what Joseph has created right at the beginning in April of 1829, which begins with Mosiah. Here we learn that there is a group of people who went up to the land of Lehi to regain their inheritance. And there's a contention and a war, civil war between these people, and most of them, except for 50, return back to Zarahemla, and then somebody then goes back to the land of their inheritance with some others who then possess it. But in Mosiah chapter 9 verse 1, we understand that Zenith is actually a spy. He's gone up with an army to destroy the Lamanites, and because he's seen that they're good and he wants them to be preserved, a fight ensues and lots of people are killed, and so he returns back to the land of Zarahemla, and then he wants to get possession, so therefore he goes up later. And then there are some external anachronisms. Verse 9 talks about seeds of different kinds. Seeds of corn, which actually corn was in the Americas, but not wheat, not barley. And then it describes Nes and Shem with all manner of fruits. There is no evidence of domesticated fruits in the Americas, not the ancient Americas, nor wheat or barley. And what are Nes and Shem? This is really reminiscent of later on in the text in Ether, when there's Kulams and Korams, the idea that there are animals that are not being named. If they don't have an English name, if we can't find them in the Americas, What are they doing in the text? They're just being made up. And then there's an understanding of feeding their flocks and taking off their flocks. The idea that there are animals being domesticated. And that's another thing that ancient America just did not have. The only one animal that got domesticated was the llama, but there was nothing else. And even though the text doesn't distinguish what they are, we know from other parts of the Book of Mormon we're talking about sheep here and goats and herds and cows. So this is just totally anachronistic. Warfare is also anachronistic because in this chapter it suggests that there are these huge discrepancies in technology that allow for this whole scale slaughter. Now, if that was the case, then we'd just totally lose these populations because they would just die out. You can't have 270 people being killed as compared to 3,043. You do that a couple of times and suddenly you don't have a population. This is actually reminiscent of early 19th century America, where they're growing all of these things and they're having all of these conflicts with Native Americans, and it's so one-sided. And even clothing is odd in Mosiah chapter 10. The idea that the people need to be clothed in their nakedness, and this is in contrast to the Lamanites who are almost naked. So this is completely 19th century early America with regard to the natives and the settlers. But this wouldn't happen in a real population because they would be subject to the same kinds of ideas and environments and rules, and so they would have similar clothing. All of these details in chapter 9 and 10 of Mosiah scream early 19th century America, not ancient America. It's a made-up story used to illustrate a point, to prove a lesson, and to help Joseph, give an understanding of his situation and environment. Just in case you hadn't had enough of me on TikTok, I am also on YouTube. I did a little interview with Latter-day Digest talking about the book and where it's at, but also a little bit about Mormon history and how it comes about and how I've learnt and developed as I have researched and written. And so there's a cute little 30-minute expose about that, and I think I come across well and talk about some really interesting points with regard to Mormon history. So check it out.